Elena clutched her mother's photograph, demanding answers from the vampire king in his marble hall. But when he traced the woman's face with trembling fingers, whispering, "My beloved," the air crystallized around them. Now she understood why her blood called to him. Elena's bare feet slapped against marble as she ran through corridors that belonged in nightmares. The photograph clutched to her chest crinkled with each desperate step. Behind her, shadows moved wrong in the torchlight. She burst through obsidian doors into the throne hall, where marble columns stretched into darkness and the scent of old roses mixed with iron. The vampire king sat motionless on his throne carved from black stone. His pale hands rested on the armrests, like marble sculptures. Around him, lesser vampires in midnight velvet turned to watch her entrance. Their eyes glittered like broken glass. Elena held up the faded photograph. Her mother smiled from the image, young and radiant in a white dress. The same image she had carried for 20 years, the only memory of a woman who died giving birth to her. But now she knew why the mansion's private chambers displayed an oil painting of Isabella Martinez in that exact pose. Why the vampire king had stared at Elena with recognition when they first met. Why her reflection flickered in mirrors. The vampire king's composure cracked. His fingers tightened on the throne. This woman, Isabella, she bore my mark. She was my chosen. The court went silent. Even the torches seemed to stop flickering. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. "Then that makes you my father." The words hung in crystallizing air. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Every vampire in the hall drew breath. The vampire king rose from his throne for the first time in decades. Impossible. But as Elena stood there clutching her mother's photograph, power hummed in her veins like electricity. The air around her began to shimmer. Light poured from beneath her skin. Every vampire in the hall dropped to their knees as Elena's hybrid heritage blazed to life, painting the marble in silver fire. The private chambers felt smaller in daylight. Elena sat on the edge of a velvet chair, staring at her hands. They looked ordinary now, human. The vampire king paced by tall windows draped in heavy curtains. Dust motes danced in thin streams of filtered light. "Your mother came to me willingly. The bonding ritual requires consent from both souls." Elena pulled her mother's journal closer. She had found it hidden behind a loose stone in the chamber wall, wrapped in oiled cloth. The pages smelled of lavender and secrets. Isabella's careful handwriting filled every page with observations about vampire society, sketches of court politics, and growing concerns about missing humans. "Half-bloods are forbidden," Elena said, reading from the journal. "The penalty is death." The vampire king stopped pacing. His reflection was absent from the mirror-lined walls, but Elena's flickered between solid and translucent. "She's not an abomination. She's a miracle." But his voice carried doubt. Elena turned a page and froze. Her mother had drawn diagrams of the council chambers, marked with names and arrows showing power structures. At the bottom of the page, in urgent scrawl, Isabella had written, "They're taking humans. The feeding grounds are slavery rings. I have to stop this." The journal trembled in Elena's hands. She pressed her palm to the paper, and the world exploded into vision. Blood pounded behind her eyes. She was her mother, running through midnight streets with evidence tucked in her coat. Fear tasted like copper. Behind her, footsteps echoed. Not one pursuer, but 3. Elena gasped, and the vision shattered. Her mother hadn't died in childbirth. Isabella had been murdered 20 years ago, and someone had covered it up. Mirror shards scattered across the training chamber floor like fallen stars. Elena stood in the center of the destruction, power crackling around her fingers. The vampire king observed from the doorway, his expression unreadable. Your mother's blood runs hot, but your father's runs eternal. Lady Morgana stepped carefully through the debris. She was elegant in the way of old vampires, with silver hair and eyes like winter sky. The combination makes you volatile. Elena tried to pull the energy back inside herself. It felt like trying to hold lightning. The mirrors had exploded when she attempted a simple levitation exercise. Now, every reflective surface in the chamber showed fractures. Her image split into a dozen fragments. We need to work on control, Morgana continued. Someone wants you dead before you learn the truth. The words sent ice through Elena's veins. What truth? But before Morgana could answer, shadows moved wrong in the corner of the room. Elena spun as a figure in black leather materialized from the darkness. Silver flashed. Elena threw her hands up instinctively, and power erupted from her palms. The assassin's dagger met her energy shield and disintegrated. The attacker stumbled backward, clutching his chest. Blood seeped between his fingers. Then he collapsed. Elena rushed forward, but the assassin was already dead. His eyes stared sightless at the ceiling. Only a silver dagger remained where he had fallen, its blade engraved with symbols Elena didn't recognize. But Morgana did. She picked up the weapon with reverence and dread. "Elder marks," she whispered. "The Council of Elders has already passed judgment." Cold stone pressed against Elena's back as she crouched in the secret passage behind the council chambers. Through gaps in the ancient masonry, she could see Elder Cassius pacing before the assembled council. His voice carried the weight of centuries and the chill of winter graveyards. "The girl is proof of your weakness, my king." The vampire king sat rigid in the defendant's chair. Chains of silver wrapped his wrists, though Elena knew he could break them if he chose. He was submitting to their authority, playing by rules that would see her dead. "She is proof of my humanity." The king's voice never wavered. Elder Cassius laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Humanity is what we left behind when we chose eternity. The abomination law exists for good reason. Hybrid creatures are unpredictable, uncontrollable. They threaten the natural order. Then I invoke my right to a trial of heritage." Elena pressed closer to the gap. The council members shifted in their high-backed chairs. Ancient law allowed for such trials, but they hadn't been used in centuries. If Elena could prove her worth to vampire society, they would have to accept her. But if she failed, the execution would be public. Elder Cassius smiled, revealing fangs like ivory daggers. "Very well. But know that your precious half-breed is already being watched. We know about her mother's investigation into the feeding grounds. We know Isabella discovered our operations." Elena's blood turned to ice. The feeding grounds weren't just feeding territories. Her mother had died because she uncovered something that threatened the council's power, something worth killing for. As the council dispersed, Elena caught the final exchange. "How long do we give her?" Elder Cassius asked. "Until the blood hunt," came the reply. 3 days to prepare. Then we finish what we started with the mother. Underground tunnels stretched endlessly ahead. Elena's feet splashed through puddles that reflected emergency lighting and fractured patterns. Behind them, hunter vampires moved through darkness with predatory grace. Their eyes glowed red in the distance like burning coals. The blood hunt had been declared at midnight. Now every vampire in the city had license to kill Elena on sight. The bounty was her head delivered to the council chambers before dawn. Morgana ran beside her, silver hair streaming. Kai brought up the rear, a young vampire who had broken with the traditionalists when Elena's heritage was revealed. He moved with liquid speed, pausing occasionally to listen for pursuit. "This way," he called, ducking into a maintenance tunnel. The abandoned subway system offered temporary refuge. Elena pressed against rusted metal, catching her breath. In her jacket pocket, Isabella's journal pages crackled. She had found more entries, hidden throughout the mansion. Her mother had been methodical in documenting the council's crimes, human trafficking operations disguised as exclusive clubs, missing persons reports that were never filed, feeding territories that were actually slavery rings where humans were kept as livestock. Your mother died because she cared about human lives, Morgana said softly. Then I'll finish what she started. Elena's voice carried new steel. Kai looked up from where he monitored the tunnel entrance. There's something else. Your mother's final research. She found proof of where the council keeps their main operation. Elena's heart hammered. Where? The old cathedral on 13th Street. The one that burned down 20 years ago. Elena's blood ran cold. That's where my mother died. Kai nodded grimly. And that's where we'll find the evidence that can destroy them. But we need to move now. Dawn was still hours away, and the hunters were closing in. Broken, stained glass crunched beneath Elena's boots as she entered the ruined cathedral. 20 years of weather had turned the sanctuary into a tomb of memories. Charred pew remains jutted from the floor like broken teeth. Above them, dawn light filtered through gaps in the collapsed roof. But the cathedral wasn't empty. Hidden beneath debris and fallen masonry, Isabella's final research station waited. Elena's mother had chosen this place for a reason. Holy ground meant nothing to vampires, but the symbolism mattered. This was where she had made her stand against monsters. Elena found the cache behind the altar. Waterproof cases held photographs, financial records, shipping manifests, and witness testimonies. Everything needed to expose the council's human trafficking empire. The feeding grounds weren't just territories. They were international operations worth millions. Humans were bought, sold, and transported like cattle to vampire courts worldwide. Your mother made you to be our salvation or our destruction, Morgana said from the cathedral entrance. Elena spun. Morgana stood silhouetted against the rising sun, but she wasn't alone. Hunter vampires flanked her on both sides, their red eyes fixed on Elena. She made me to choose. Elena's heart shattered and rebuilt itself in the same instant. Morgana had been reporting to Elder Cassius all along. Every training session, every conversation, every moment of trust had been a lie. I'm sorry, Morgana whispered, but change costs too much. The hunters moved forward in perfect coordination. Elena clutched her mother's evidence and felt power rise in her chest. Light poured from her skin as hybrid heritage blazed to life. The cathedral filled with silver fire as Elena prepared to make the same choice her mother had made 20 years ago. She would fight for the truth, even if it killed her. The safe house candles flickered as Elena spread Isabella's evidence across the table. Photographs of human captives stared up at her with hollow eyes. Shipping manifests detailed transport routes between vampire territories. Financial records showed payments worth millions flowing through council accounts. Kai studied the documents while keeping watch at the boarded windows. After Elena's escape from the cathedral, they had taken refuge in an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district. Morgana's betrayal had shattered their original network, but new allies emerged from unexpected places. Young vampires who questioned the old ways, humans who had known Isabella and believed in her cause, former council servants who had grown sick of the corruption. You're not just fighting for your life anymore, Kai said quietly. You're fighting for theirs. He gestured toward the photographs. Elena knew he was right. This was bigger than her heritage or even her mother's murder. The council had built an empire on human suffering, and she was the only one who could tear it down. Then I won't lose. Meanwhile, across the city, the vampire king sat under house arrest in his own chambers. Silver chains bound him to prevent escape, but his mind worked furiously. The council had moved against him the moment Elena fled. Elder Cassius now wore the regent's crown and issued orders in his name. But the king had allies too. Servants loyal to the old ways of honor. Guards who remembered when vampires protected the innocent instead of preying on them. Messages moved through the mansion in whispered conversations and meaningful glances. A resistance was building. The grand assembly was scheduled for tomorrow night. Every vampire of importance would attend. It was the council's chance to present Elena as a monster and justify her execution. But it was also Elena's chance to present the truth. The evidence was damning enough to topple governments. But first, she had to survive long enough to use it. As midnight approached, Elena received word that made her blood freeze. The council planned to kill human prisoners at the Grand Assembly and blame their deaths on her. The frame would be complete. She would be painted as the monster her mother had died trying to stop. The Grand Assembly ballroom glittered like a jeweled cave. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across marble floors. Vampire nobility mingled in elegant gowns and tailored suits, their pale beauty terrible and perfect. Elena moved among them wearing borrowed finery and a disguise that hid her hybrid nature. Temporary glamour magic made her skin alabaster and her eyes the cold blue of winter sky. She looked like any other vampire noble attending the century's most important gathering. But beneath the ballroom, in chambers most guests would never see, human prisoners waited in silver-barred cells. Elena had glimpsed them during her reconnaissance. 20 men and women who would die tonight unless she acted. The council's plan was elegant in its cruelty. At midnight, Elder Cassius would reveal Elena's presence and claim she had murdered the prisoners in a blood-mad frenzy. The deaths would justify the abomination law and make Elena a monster in the eyes of vampire society. No one would question her execution after such horror. Elena positioned herself near the main staircase and waited. Around her, vampires discussed politics and territory disputes in voices like silk over steel. They were beautiful and deadly, and completely unaware that their world was about to change forever. At 11:30, the ballroom doors burst open. The vampire king strode in wearing formal regalia, silver crown gleaming on his dark hair. His entrance sent whispers through the crowd. Elder Cassius had announced his imprisonment, but here he stood free and proud. Their eyes met across the ballroom. Elena saw love and fear and desperate hope in his gaze. "Tonight we end this charade," she whispered, knowing vampire hearing would carry her words to him. "Together," he replied, and the sound was a promise. At the stroke of midnight, Elder Cassius called for attention. The ceremony to expose the monster among them was about to begin. Crystal glasses shattered as Elena threw back her disguise. Glamour magic dissolved like morning mist, revealing her hybrid nature to the assembled court. Gasps echoed through the ballroom as her skin began to glow with inherited power. She stood in the center of the marble floor, Isabella's evidence clutched in her hands, and faced down centuries of vampire tradition. "I am my mother's daughter and my father's heir," her voice carried to every corner of the ballroom. "I am the bridge you fear." Elder Cassius snarled from the dais, "Seize the abomination!" Guards moved forward, but the vampire king's voice cracked like thunder. "Stop!" He stepped beside Elena, silver crown blazing in the chandelier light. "I claim her as my acknowledged heir and invoke her right to challenge this corruption." Elena raised her mother's photographs above her head. 20 years ago, Isabella Martinez died investigating the council's crimes. Tonight, you plan to murder innocents and blame me for their deaths, but I have proof of what you really are. She scattered the evidence across the marble floor. Photographs of captive humans, shipping manifests, financial records, witness testimonies. Every document told the same story. The Council of Elders had built their power on human trafficking and slavery. The assembled vampires stared at the evidence in growing horror. Some had suspected, but seeing the truth laid bare shattered their willingness to look away. Elder Cassius raised his hand, and shadows gathered around his fingers. "Enough. She dies now." Power erupted from his palm like black lightning. Elena threw up her own shield as silver fire met shadow magic in the center of the ballroom. The impact shattered windows and cracked marble columns. When the light faded, Elena stood unharmed while Elder Cassius stumbled backward. "And I claim my right to challenge this corruption," Elena repeated. Ancient law demanded trial by combat when accusations this serious were made against council members. Cassius could not refuse without admitting guilt. "Very well," he hissed. "The right of blood justice. At dawn, we settle this permanently." Dawn light streamed through the assembly's great windows as Elena faced Elder Cassius in the ritual circle. Marble benches surrounded the combat space where vampire law had been decided for 1,000 years. Every court member sat in witness. The rules were simple: single combat until death or surrender. No weapons except those gifted by bloodline. Elena's hybrid nature gave her access to both vampire speed and human intuition. But Cassius had centuries of experience and power drawn from countless victims. They circled each other like wolves. Elena's skin shimmered with inherited light, while shadows writhed around Cassius like living things. He moved first, shadow tendrils lashing out to bind her arms. Elena twisted away and responded with a burst of silver fire that seared the air between them. The fight became a deadly dance. Elena's human heritage let her think in ways that confused vampire instincts. She feinted left and struck right, used her smaller size to slip inside Cassius's guard. But he was stronger and faster, and shadows gave him reach she couldn't match. Blood ran down her arms from shadow cuts. "I choose to remain human," she gasped as silver fire blazed around her fists. "Then you choose to die," Cassius replied. His shadows formed spears of solid darkness. "I choose to live," Elena said, and threw everything she had into one final attack. Light erupted from her body like a star going nova. When it faded, Cassius lay broken on the marble floor. His shadows were gone. His power had burned away. And Elena stood victorious but changed. The light in her skin was fading. Her hybrid nature was consuming itself, burning out like a candle. She had chosen to remain human, and that choice came with a price. She would age and die like any mortal, but she had won the right to remake vampire law. As the assembly watched in awed silence, Elena helped Elder Cassius to his feet. He was powerless now, just another vampire facing justice for his crimes. "Your trafficking operations are over," she said. "Your victims will be freed, and vampire law will protect the innocent." The renovated council chambers buzzed with voices speaking a dozen languages as Elena reviewed reports from around the world. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been sealed for centuries, warming mahogany tables where humans and vampires sat side by side. The new council included representatives from both species, their combined perspectives reshaping policies that had remained unchanged for millennia. Maria Santos, a human rights lawyer who had survived one of the trafficking rings, spread photographs across the table. "These are the last 3 facilities we've identified in Eastern Europe, but the local vampire lords are resisting our jurisdiction." Elena studied the images. Children stared back at her with haunted eyes. The council's network had been vast, tentacles reaching into every major city. Dismantling it required patience and careful coordination with human law enforcement. "Change doesn't end with one victory," Elena said, marking locations on their operational map. "Then we keep fighting," replied Marcus, a young vampire who had joined their cause after witnessing the assembly revelations. His enthusiasm reminded Elena of herself a year ago, before she learned that victory came with endless responsibility. The vampire king entered carrying diplomatic pouches marked with official seals. He had abdicated his throne but remained Elena's closest advisor in navigating supernatural politics. His pale features showed strain. "These arrived from the European Vampire Covenant this morning." Elena opened the first envelope and her blood chilled. formal declarations of non-recognition covered in elaborate script. The old vampire houses refused to acknowledge the new laws. Some threatened to cut all ties with American territories. Others hinted at more direct action. Cassius had allies across the ocean who viewed Elena's reforms as dangerous precedent. "We knew this would happen," Elena said, though her voice carried weariness. "The trafficking operations were profitable for vampires worldwide. They won't give up without a fight." She moved to the window and gazed out at the city beyond. Humans walked the streets unaware that their safety now depended on maintaining a delicate balance between species. One mistake, one incident that exposed the supernatural world, and everything they had built could collapse into chaos. The vampire king joined her at the window. His reflection was absent from the glass, but hers flickered with the last traces of her fading hybrid nature. "You're mortal now," he said quietly. "Your lifespan is measured in decades instead of centuries. Does that frighten you?" Elena considered the question. "Sometimes. But mortality gives urgency to the work. Every day matters when you don't have eternity." She touched the glass where her reflection wavered. "Besides, change doesn't require immortality. It requires people willing to plant trees whose shade they'll never enjoy." A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Kai entered with a young girl whose eyes held the telltale flicker of hybrid heritage. She was perhaps 12 years old, clutching a worn photograph much as Elena had done a year ago. "This is Sarah," Kai said gently. "Her grandmother was bonded to a vampire in Montreal. She's been having visions, and her adoptive parents don't understand what's happening." Elena knelt to the girl's eye level. The photograph showed a woman in 1950s dress standing beside a man whose reflection was conspicuously absent from a storefront window behind them. "You're not alone anymore," Elena promised. "We're going to help you understand what you are." As Sarah joined the other hybrid children they had gathered, Elena felt a familiar surge of purpose. The school was still small, housed in converted mansion wings, but it represented hope for a future where children like Sarah wouldn't face persecution for their dual nature. Evening approached as Elena reviewed the final reports of the day. International vampire resistance was growing more organized. The European Covenant had appointed a new elder council with explicit instructions to contain American reforms. Trade agreements were being canceled, ancient alliances were dissolving. But there was progress, too. Younger vampires were embracing the new laws. Human governments were quietly establishing supernatural liaison offices. The trafficking operations were crumbling as victims found the courage to come forward. Elena was reviewing security protocols when Marcus burst through the chamber doors. His face was pale, even by vampire standards. "Elena, you need to see this." He handed her an ornate envelope bearing the Covenant's official seal. Inside, elegant script delivered an ultimatum. The European Vampire Covenant demanded Elena's immediate surrender to face charges of species treason. The deadline was 1 week. Failure to comply would result in a formal declaration of war between Old World and New World vampire territories. And war between vampires would inevitably expose the supernatural world to humanity. The masquerade that had protected both species for millennia would shatter, leaving chaos in its wake. Elena set the letter aside and looked around the chamber at her mixed council of humans and vampires working together. Everything they had built hung in the balance. But surrender wasn't an option. Too many lives depended on the reforms they had implemented. Too many children like Sarah needed the protection of the new laws. She would find another way. She always did. Spring flowers covered Isabella's grave in waves of color that shifted with the morning breeze. Elena knelt beside the marble headstone, placing fresh roses among the daffodils and tulips left by others who remembered her mother's courage. 1 year had passed since the assembly revelations, and the world continued to change in ways both wonderful and terrifying. "Mom, I finished what you started," Elena whispered to the stone, "and now I'm starting something new." The reformed mansion behind her buzzed with activity as hybrid children attended morning classes. Their laughter carried across the grounds, a sound that would have been impossible under the old laws. Elena had established the school 6 months ago when it became clear that her example was inspiring other mixed unions between species. The children ranged in age from 5 to 16, each struggling to understand abilities that made them bridges between human and vampire worlds. Sarah had become something of a leader among them, her early arrival giving her status as Elena's first student. The girl had learned to control her visions and was helping newer students navigate their emerging powers. Teaching them gave Elena purpose beyond politics and international crises. These children were the future she and her mother had fought to create. The vampire king approached through the cemetery gates, carrying a small bundle wrapped in soft blankets. He moved with careful grace, his immortal strength carefully controlled around such fragile cargo. Elena smiled as he joined her beside Isabella's grave. "How is she this morning?" Elena asked, accepting the bundle with practiced ease. "Growing stronger every day," he replied. His voice carried wonder that still surprised him after all these centuries. The baby in Elena's arms was barely 2 months old, but her eyes already held the telltale flicker of hybrid heritage. Isabella Rose Martinez, named for her grandmother and the flowers that surrounded her grave. She represented everything the old council had feared and everything the new world promised. Elena had discovered her pregnancy just as the European crisis was escalating. The timing was terrible and perfect. Another bridge child, born into a world still learning to accept them. The baby's existence gave both their enemies and allies pause. Even the European Covenant hesitated to declare war on a nursing mother whose child embodied the future of vampire-human relations. "She's beautiful," Elena murmured, studying her daughter's tiny features. The baby's skin held the faintest luminescence, visible only in certain light. Her heartbeat was stronger than purely human children, her reflexes already showing supernatural enhancement. But she would face choices Elena never had. She would grow up knowing her dual nature instead of discovering it through trauma and loss. Together, Elena and the Vampire King walked back toward the mansion. The building itself had transformed over the past year. Ancient halls now echoed with children's voices instead of whispered conspiracies. Sunlight was welcome in rooms that had been sealed in darkness for centuries. The throne room had been converted into a library where hybrid children could research their heritage without shame or fear. Gardens bloomed where courtiers once plotted assassinations. As they reached the mansion's front steps, Elena paused to look back at her mother's grave. Isabella had died believing she was fighting a hopeless battle against impossible odds. But her sacrifice had planted seeds that were still growing. The trafficking operations were nearly dismantled worldwide. Vampire law now protected the innocent instead of exploiting them. Hybrid children had safe places to learn and grow. The European Covenant still posed threats, and international politics remained treacherous. Elena's mortality meant she had perhaps 50 years to secure the changes they had fought to implement. But looking at her daughter's peaceful face, Elena felt hope outweighing fear. Change was never the work of a single generation. It required people willing to plant trees whose shade they would never enjoy, willing to build foundations for houses they would never live to see completed. Elena had finished her mother's work and begun something new. Isabella Rose would continue it in ways Elena couldn't imagine. And perhaps her granddaughter would complete what they had started. Inside the mansion, Elena placed a new photograph beside her mother's portrait. It showed the integrated family they had created, humans and vampires together with hope for the future. Hybrid children played in gardens where assassins once lurked. Young couples from both species walked hand in hand through halls that had known only fear and isolation. The Vampire King held his daughter while Elena's human warmth brought light to shadows that had lingered for centuries. The photograph captured a moment of peace in an ongoing struggle, proof that love and justice could indeed bridge any divide. As Isabella Rose slept in her father's arms, Elena began planning lessons for the afternoon. There were 15 new hybrid students arriving next month, children whose parents had found courage in Elena's example. The European situation required delicate negotiation that could take years to resolve. The school needed expansion to accommodate growing enrollment. Her mortality added urgency to every decision, but it also brought focus. She was building something that would outlast her human lifespan while cherishing every moment of the time she had chosen to keep. Outside, spring continued its ancient work of renewal. Inside, the future took shape one small victory at a time. Elena Martinez had asked a vampire king why her mother's photograph hung in his mansion. The answer had changed both their worlds and opened possibilities neither had dared imagine. Now their daughter would grow up in a world where such questions led to understanding instead of tragedy, where bridges between species were celebrated instead of feared. The revolution her mother had started with a camera and impossible courage would continue in ways Isabella could never have dreamed. But she would have been proud. Elena's boots clicked against wet pavement as she navigated the maze of abandoned warehouses that comprised the city's supernatural underground. 3 months had passed since the European Covenant's ultimatum, and their agents were already operating on American soil. She clutched intelligence reports detailing vampire safehouses being raided, hybrid children disappearing from protective custody, and allies vanishing without trace. The Covenant wasn't waiting for her surrender. They were dismantling everything she had built piece by piece. Kai emerged from the shadows of a loading dock, his usual confidence replaced by grim urgency. "They hit the Montreal facility last night," he reported, "took 12 children and left 3 dead. The local authorities are calling it a gas explosion." Elena's jaw tightened. Sarah had cousins in that facility. The girl was already struggling with nightmares about her visions intensifying. This news would devastate her. "How many safe houses do we have left?" Elena asked. Kai consulted his encrypted tablet. 17 confirmed secure. Maybe 20 if the ones in radio silence are still operational. But Elena, they're not just hitting facilities, they're targeting the children's families. Human parents who took in hybrid kids are being murdered and made to look like accidents. The strategy was brutally efficient. The Covenant knew Elena's greatest weakness was her inability to ignore innocent suffering. They were forcing her to choose between surrender and watching everything she had built burn around her. Inside the warehouse, Elena's war council had assembled around tables covered in tactical maps and surveillance photos. Marcus coordinated communications with remaining safe houses, while Dr. Chen, a human geneticist who studied hybrid physiology, reviewed medical files of missing children. The Vampire King stood before a wall of photographs showing the disappeared. His immortal composure couldn't hide the fury burning behind his eyes. 23 children confirmed taken, he reported, ages 6 to 16. The Covenant is holding them at undisclosed locations across 3 countries. Elena studied the faces staring back from the photos. Each child represented a family torn apart, a future stolen, a bridge between species that the old world was determined to destroy. Among them was James, a shy 10-year-old who could phase through solid matter. Maria, a teenager whose empathic abilities let her calm both humans and vampires. David, barely 8, whose precognitive flashes had already saved dozens of lives. "They're not just targeting the children," Dr. Chen interjected. "Blood samples were taken from every raid site. They're studying hybrid genetics." Elena's blood chilled. The Covenant wasn't just trying to eliminate hybrid children. They were trying to understand how to create them. The implications were staggering. If they could produce hybrids under controlled conditions, they could build armies of bridge beings loyal to the old ways. They could corrupt everything Elena's reforms represented. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Marcus said. "The other North American territories are wavering. If we can't protect the children, they'll start making separate peace with the covenant. Elena moved to the communications station where messages from around the world painted a picture of growing crisis. The Asian vampire houses had declared neutrality, effectively abandoning Elena's coalition. South American territories were demanding proof that the new laws could survive international pressure. Even progressive vampires who had supported the reforms were beginning to question whether the cost was too high. Then we give them proof, Elena said. She turned to face the assembled council. The Covenant thinks they can force my surrender by targeting innocents. They're wrong. We're going to rescue every single child they've taken, and we're going to do it in a way that shows the world exactly what the old ways really represent. The Vampire King stepped beside her. That's suicide, Elena. They have centuries more experience and resources we can't match. Elena smiled, but it held no warmth. They also have something we don't. Arrogance. They think they understand what hybrid children can do because they've read reports and studied blood samples, but they've never tried to hold bridge beings who don't want to be held. She gestured toward the photographs on the wall. Every one of those children has abilities the Covenant has never encountered. James can walk through walls. Maria can influence emotions across species barriers. David can see attacks coming before they happen. Put them together in the same facility. And you don't have prisoners. You have a rescue team waiting for the right moment to act. Understanding dawned in Kai's eyes. You want to let them take more children. Let them concentrate the hybrids in fewer locations. Not let them, Elena corrected. Help them. She moved to a map showing Covenant operation sites. If we can identify their main holding facility, we can turn their own strategy against them. But it means putting more children at risk. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Elena was proposing to use hybrid children as bait in a trap that could either save them all or get them killed. Dr. Chen was the first to speak. The psychological trauma alone could cause permanent damage. These children have already been through hell. Elena nodded gravely. I know, but leaving them in Covenant hands guarantees worse than trauma. It guarantees they'll never see their families again, and it guarantees the old ways will spread back across the world like poison. She looked around the room at faces that had become her family over the past year. I won't make this decision alone. We vote. Anyone who can't live with the risk can walk away now. No judgment, no consequences. Nobody moved. Marcus was the first to raise his hand in agreement. The Vampire King followed, then Kai, then Dr. Chen. One by one, every member of Elena's council committed to a plan that could save or damn everything they had fought for. The rescue operation would require precision timing, perfect intelligence, and luck they couldn't count on. But it was their only chance to prove that the new ways were worth defending. As dawn approached, Elena stood alone in the warehouse looking at photographs of missing children. Each face represented a choice she was making for them, a risk she was taking with lives that weren't hers to gamble. Isabella Rose slept peacefully in her carrier beside Elena's chair, unaware that her mother was planning something that could leave her orphaned. But Elena thought of her own mother's sacrifice, of Isabella Martinez running through midnight streets with evidence that could save lives. Some fights were worth any risk. Some bridges were worth building even if you died laying the foundation. The European Covenant was about to learn what happened when they threatened Elena's family. And the world was about to discover what hybrid children could accomplish when they stopped hiding and started fighting back. Elena placed her hand over her daughter's sleeping form and made a silent promise. She would rescue every taken child. She would prove that the new ways could protect the innocent. And she would build a world where Isabella Rose could grow up without fearing persecution for her heritage. The war for the future of vampire-human relations was about to begin in earnest. Elena pressed her face against the cold concrete wall of the abandoned subway tunnel, listening to footsteps echo from 3 different directions. The blood hunt had been declared at midnight, exactly as Elder Cassius had planned, and now every vampire in the city could legally kill her for the bounty on her head. Beside her, Morgana checked ammunition in weapons that could wound immortals, while Kai consulted maps showing routes through the underground maze that had become their temporary refuge. The scent of old subway systems mixed with something worse, the metallic tang of spilled blood that meant other hunted beings had passed this way recently. "Your mother died because she cared about human lives," Kai whispered, his young face grim with knowledge that aged him beyond his apparent years. "Then I'll finish what she started," Elena replied, clutching the research documents they had salvaged from her mother's hidden safe house. Isabella's investigation into the feeding grounds had revealed a network of human trafficking that stretched across continents, with the Vampire Council profiting from modern slavery rings disguised as exclusive clubs. The evidence was damning enough to topple governments, but only if Elena survived long enough to present it. Through the tunnel entrance, red eyes glowed in the darkness. Hunter vampires moved with predatory grace, their enhanced senses tracking traces of Elena's hybrid blood through the labyrinthine underground. She could feel their hunger like pressure against her skin, ancient creatures who had spent centuries perfecting the art of the hunt. These weren't courtiers or politicians. These were killers unleashed by the Council's formal declaration. Morgana gestured toward a maintenance passage that led deeper into the city's forgotten infrastructure. The tunnels connected to steam systems, electrical conduits, and water mains that honeycombed the urban foundation. If they could reach the old cathedral district, they might find sanctuary in consecrated ground that even vampires hesitated to violate. But the journey required passing through territory controlled by vampire lords who would sell Elena's location for council favor. As they moved through narrow passages, Elena's newfound abilities flickered unpredictably. Her shadow walking allowed brief phases through solid matter, but the power drained her quickly and left her vulnerable. Her enhanced senses picked up conversations through walls, heartbeats through floors, the whispered plans of enemies tracking her movement. But she couldn't control when the abilities manifested, making them as dangerous as helpful. Kai led them through a junction where 5 tunnels converged, his intimate knowledge of the underground proving invaluable. He had spent decades helping supernatural refugees escape persecution, building networks that the Council had never suspected existed. His maps showed safe houses, hidden caches of supplies, and routes that avoided the most dangerous hunting grounds. But even Kai's expertise couldn't eliminate all risks. They emerged into a wider space that had once been a subway platform, now claimed by the city's homeless population, who existed in the spaces between human and vampire awareness. Blankets and cardboard shelters created a makeshift community that operated by its own rules. Some residents were human, others were supernatural beings seeking anonymity. A few were hybrids like Elena, refugees from the Council's centuries of persecution. An elderly woman approached Elena with recognition flickering in her eyes. "You're Isabella's daughter," she said quietly. "I knew your mother when she was investigating the disappearances. She helped my grandson escape before they could take him to the feeding grounds." Elena knelt beside the woman, whose weathered hands held memories of loss that resonated with Elena's own grief. "How many people did the council take?" Elena asked. The woman's eyes hardened. "Thousands over the years. Young humans with no families to report them missing. Runaways and addicts who wouldn't be believed if they talked. The clubs were recruitment centers disguised as exclusive entertainment venues. Your mother documented everything before they silenced her." She produced a worn photograph showing Isabella Martinez standing outside a building Elena recognized from the research files. The Crimson Rose, one of the most prestigious nightclubs in the city, was actually a front for the council's trafficking operation. High-paying vampire clients enjoyed not just feeding, but complete dominance over human victims who were treated as disposable commodities. Elena stared at the photograph, understanding flooding through her like ice water. Her mother hadn't been investigating abstract corruption. She had been trying to save specific people whose names and faces appeared in meticulous records. The council hadn't killed Isabella to protect political power. They had murdered her to continue profiting from human misery. Morgana touched Elena's shoulder gently. We need to keep moving. The hunters are getting closer, and this many people in one place creates too much risk. As they prepared to leave the platform community, Elena noticed something that made her blood freeze. Among the homeless residents were faces she recognized from her mother's research files. Missing persons who had been reported dead were living in the underground, too traumatized to return to the surface world. The council's trafficking operation hadn't just stolen their freedom, it had stolen their entire identities. Elena made a decision that would have terrified her a week ago. These people deserved justice as much as she deserved answers. Her mother's investigation had to be completed not just for Elena's sake, but for every victim the council had discarded as worthless. She would finish what Isabella Martinez had started, even if it cost Elena her life. Following Kai through passages that led toward the cathedral district, Elena clutched evidence that could transform vampire society. But first she had to survive long enough to present it. Behind them, the sound of hunting vampires grew closer. Ahead lay the abandoned cathedral where her mother had died, and perhaps where Elena would discover the final pieces of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of supernatural power. The hunt was far from over, but Elena was no longer just running. She was running toward the truth that would either vindicate her mother's sacrifice or ensure both their deaths had meaning in the fight against institutionalized evil. Dawn approached as they climbed toward street level, carrying with them the hopes of the forgotten and the evidence that could change everything. Elena pushed against the cathedral's heavy wooden doors, their hinges screaming protest that echoed through the ruined nave like a death cry. Sunlight streamed through broken stained glass windows, casting rainbow fragments across stone floors stained with decades of neglect, and something darker that Elena tried not to identify. This was where her mother had died, where Isabella Martinez had made her final stand against the council's conspiracy. The air itself seemed to remember violence, pressing against Elena's skin with memories of blood and betrayal. Morgana swept the shadows with weapons drawn, while Kai secured the entrance behind them. The cathedral had been abandoned for 30 years, but vampire scent markers indicated recent activity. Someone had been using this space as a meeting place, and Elena suspected she knew who. Hidden beneath altar stones, her mother's final cache of evidence waited to be discovered. But so did the trap that Elder Cassius had spent months preparing. Your mother made you to be our salvation or our destruction, Morgana said quietly, watching Elena approach the altar where bloodstains marked Isabella's final moments. She made me to choose, Elena replied, kneeling beside stones that had been carefully disturbed and replaced. Her enhanced senses detected hidden compartments beneath the altar, spaces where her mother had concealed documentation that the council had never found. The evidence Elena sought was here, waiting to either vindicate Isabella's sacrifice or condemn them both. As Elena pried up altar stones with strength inherited from her vampire heritage, Kai called out from the cathedral entrance. We have company, multiple vehicles approaching from 3 directions. They know we're here. Elena's hands worked frantically to access her mother's hidden files while her mind calculated escape routes that didn't exist. The cathedral stood on elevated ground with clear sightlines in every direction. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The hunt had led them exactly where the council wanted them to be. Inside the hidden compartment, Elena found photographs that made her stomach lurch. The feeding grounds weren't just trafficking centers. They were research facilities where the council conducted experiments on hybrid children, studying the genetic factors that created bridge beings between species. Her mother had documented medical procedures, genetic sampling, and breeding programs designed to create controllable hybrids loyal to vampire authority. The evidence was overwhelming and damning, but it came with a revelation that shattered everything Elena thought she knew about her own existence. Among the research files was a detailed genetic profile bearing her name and photograph taken when she was barely 6 years old. Elena Martinez hadn't been born from accidental love between species. She had been created in a council laboratory. Her hybrid nature the result of deliberate genetic manipulation designed to produce the perfect bridge between human and vampire worlds. Isabella Martinez hadn't just been investigating the council's crimes. She had been trying to expose her own participation in creating Elena as a weapon that could be used by either side in the coming war between species. The woman Elena remembered as her loving mother had been a council scientist who developed a conscience too late to undo what she had done. Morgana moved closer, reading over Elena's shoulder as the truth emerged from decades of hidden files. "Your mother didn't betray the council by accident," Morgana said softly. "She betrayed them because she realized they intended to use you to eliminate hybrid children who couldn't be controlled. You were designed to be the ultimate hunter, able to track and kill your own kind." Elena stared at photographs showing herself as a child in laboratory settings she had no memory of experiencing. Her earliest recollections had been altered, her childhood fabricated to hide the truth about her origins. Everything she thought she knew about Isabella's love and sacrifice was built on lies designed to make Elena trust the woman who had created her as a weapon. But there was more. Among the files, Elena found recordings of her mother's final months, saw audio logs that revealed Isabella's growing horror at what she had participated in creating. The woman's voice, preserved in digital files, spoke directly to the daughter she would never see grow up. "Elena, if you're hearing this, it means I'm dead, and you've discovered the truth I tried to hide from you. I know you'll hate me for what I did, for creating you as a tool for others to use. But I need you to understand that my love for you became more real than anything else in my life. You were supposed to be a weapon. Instead, you became my redemption." The recording continued as sunlight shifted through broken windows and the sound of approaching vehicles grew closer. Isabella's voice carried desperate urgency as she explained the genetic triggers embedded in Elena's hybrid nature, the conditioning that was supposed to make her loyal to council authority, and the antidotes she had developed to free her daughter from biological programming. "You have a choice, Elena. You can embrace what they made you to be, or you can choose to become something they never imagined. The power to destroy hybrid children is also the power to save them. The decision is yours, and I pray I taught you enough about love to choose correctly." Elena clutched the recordings as footsteps echoed through the cathedral entrance. Elder Cassius entered with a squad of hunter vampires, their eyes reflecting satisfaction at cornering their prey in the perfect location. But his expression shifted to concern as he noticed the scattered files surrounding Elena's position. "What have you found, child?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "I found the truth," Elena replied, standing beside the altar where her mother had died. "I know what I am, what you made me to be, and I know what I choose to become." The files scattered around Elena contained evidence of the council's crimes spanning centuries, but they also contained something more dangerous. They contained the location of every remaining hybrid child, the genetic triggers that could control or kill them, and the research necessary to create an army of bridge beings programmed for absolute loyalty. Elder Cassius had allowed Elena to find this evidence because he expected her conditioning to activate, transforming her from rebel into the perfect weapon he had spent decades developing. But Isabella's love had been stronger than council programming, and Elena's choice would reshape the supernatural world in ways no one could predict. Morgana raised her weapons as hunter vampires surrounded the altar, but Elena gestured for her to stand down. The time for running was over. The time for truth had begun. And the cathedral where Isabella Martinez had died was about to witness either Elena's surrender to her programmed nature or her final transformation into something the council had never intended to create. The sun reached its zenith as Elena faced the vampire who had orchestrated her creation and her mother's death, carrying evidence that would either damn them both or change everything. Elena pulled Isabella's research files against her chest as Elder Cassius descended the cathedral steps, his ancient eyes reflecting centuries of calculated patience finally reaching fruition. Hunter vampires flanked him on both sides, their movements precise and predatory, but Elena noticed something in their positioning that spoke to deeper strategy. They weren't just surrounding her, they were herding her towards specific locations within the cathedral where hidden cameras could record whatever happened next. "You've exceeded even my expectations, child," Elder Cassius said, his voice carrying satisfaction that made Elena's hybrid blood burn with inherited fury. "I wondered if Isabella's maternal conditioning would override your true programming. But here you stand, exactly where you need to be, with exactly the evidence required to complete your purpose." Elena's enhanced senses picked up electronic signals from concealed recording equipment throughout the cathedral. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a performance being broadcast to vampire authorities worldwide. The council intended to use whatever happened here as justification for policies that would reshape supernatural society. Morgana shifted beside Elena, her weapons trained on the nearest hunters, but Elena could smell her advisor's fear cutting through the cathedral's musty air. Morgana had suspected Elena's true origins, but hadn't understood the full scope of the council's manipulation. Even she was learning the depths of the conspiracy for the first time. Among the scattered research files, one photograph caught Elena's attention. It showed her as a child standing beside other hybrid subjects, their faces blank with artificial conditioning that had been programmed into their developing minds. Most of those children were dead now, eliminated when their usefulness expired. Elena was the only success, the only weapon that had developed exactly as intended while maintaining enough autonomy to be believable as a natural occurrence. "You killed them," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying accusation that echoed through the ruined nave. "All those children in the research programs. You eliminated them when they couldn't be controlled perfectly." Elder Cassius nodded without shame. "Failed experiments are disposed of efficiently. But you, Elena, represent perfection in biological engineering. Your hybrid nature grants you access to both human and vampire communities. Your programming ensures loyalty to proper authority. And your apparent rebellion provides the perfect cover for infiltrating resistance movements that threaten established order." Elena understood with crystalline clarity what the council expected from her. They believed her programming would activate under stress, transforming her from apparent rebel into their ultimate infiltration asset. She was supposed to eliminate Morgana and Kai here in this cathedral, proving her loyalty while being recorded doing it. Then she would return to the underground resistance as a supposed survivor, carrying false intelligence that would lead to the capture or death of every vampire who opposed council authority. "The programming is triggered by proximity to hybrid genetic material," Elder Cassius explained, gesturing toward files that contained blood samples from dozens of bridge children. "Your mother tried to create antidotes, but biological imperative always overcomes learned behavior. You were designed to hunt your own kind, Elena, and that design will assert itself momentarily." Elena felt something stirring in her bloodstream, a foreign impulse that pushed against her conscious will. The genetic triggers Isabella had tried to neutralize were responding to chemical compounds released from the research files, engineered molecules that activated dormant conditioning through scent and proximity. Her vision began to shift, her enhanced senses focusing on Morgana and Kai with predatory intensity that felt completely alien yet undeniably part of her nature. But Isabella's love had been deeper than council programming. Among the research files, Elena found her mother's final gift: genetic modification formulas that didn't eliminate the conditioning but rather expanded it beyond the council's narrow parameters. Instead of hunting only hybrid children, Elena's triggered state would target any supernatural being who harmed innocents regardless of their species or authority. Elder Cassius had activated his perfect weapon, but Isabella had ensured that weapon would turn against its creators. Elena's transformation began as chemical triggers flooded her system, but instead of focusing on her allies, her enhanced senses locked onto the hunter vampires surrounding them. Centuries of feeding on unwilling humans had left psychic imprints that her modified programming read as threats to be eliminated. The genetic conditioning that was supposed to make her the Council's ultimate asset instead marked Elder Cassius and his hunters as targets worthy of destruction. "I choose," Elena said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through both human and vampire frequency ranges. Isabella's final modification had given Elena something the Council never intended: the power to choose which programming to embrace. Her hybrid nature responded to the decision by unleashing abilities that transcended anything seen in previous experiments. Shadow walking merged with enhanced strength, allowing Elena to phase through attacks while striking back with devastating precision. Her empathic senses, designed to track hybrid children, instead detected the emotional resonance of every victim the hunters had claimed over their immortal lifespans. She became justice incarnate, programmed by her mother's love to protect the innocent rather than serve authority. The cathedral erupted into supernatural combat, as Elena fought not just for her own survival, but for the vindication of every victim whose blood stained these ancient stones. Elder Cassius discovered that his perfect weapon had indeed been perfected, but not in the way he had intended. Outside, dawn light streaming through broken stained glass illuminated a battle that would determine whether Elena's choices could overcome the conditioning of her creation, whether love could triumph over programming, and whether the evidence scattered across the cathedral floor would expose the Council's crimes or become buried with the bodies of those who dared to seek justice. The hunt that had driven Elena to this place was ending, but her true purpose as a bridge between worlds was just beginning to emerge from the ashes of everything the Council had tried to make her become. Elena dragged herself through ventilation shafts that connected the cathedral basement to the old steam tunnel network, her shadow walking abilities finally stable enough to phase through obstacles without collapsing from exhaustion. The Vampire King's voice echoed through encrypted communications as Kai guided them towards safe houses scattered throughout the city's forgotten infrastructure. Behind them, the cathedral burned with supernatural fire that would consume all evidence of the battle that had nearly claimed Elena's life. The Council's false flag operation had backfired spectacularly when Elena's modified programming turned against its creators, but Elder Cassius had escaped with enough hunter vampires to regroup and plan their next assault. Through cracked smartphone screens, Elena watched news reports of vampire authorities worldwide declaring her a terrorist threat to supernatural stability. The footage from the cathedral had been edited to show only her attacking council members, with no context about their crimes or her mother's evidence. Public opinion in both human and vampire communities was turning against her, exactly as the council intended. She clutched hard drives containing Isabella's complete research while coordinating with resistance cells that had spent decades preparing for this moment. The evidence Elena had recovered wasn't just documentation of trafficking operations, it was a complete blueprint of the Council's control systems, their methods for manipulating human governments, and their plans for a supernatural order that would reduce humanity to livestock status. But presenting this evidence required reaching the Grand Assembly, where vampire law demanded that accusations against council members be heard before the entire supernatural community. Elena's allies were scattered across the city in hiding places that grew less secure by the hour. Younger vampires who had rallied to her cause found themselves hunted by their own elders, forced to choose between centuries of tradition and Elena's promise of reform. Human supporters faced even greater danger, their mortality making them vulnerable to retribution that could eliminate entire families. The former king worked from his own captivity to coordinate resistance efforts, His messages passed through networks of servants and lesser nobles who still believed in his vision of coexistence. But even his authority had limits when the council controlled the Grand Assembly's agenda and the hunter vampires who enforced their will. "You're not just fighting for your life anymore," Elena's allies reminded her through encrypted channels. "You're fighting for theirs. Every human in every trafficking operation, every hybrid child in every research facility, every vampire who believes in something better than what the council offers." "Then I won't lose," Elena replied, studying blueprints of the Grand Assembly building while her enhanced senses tracked approaching danger through multiple channels. The assembly would convene in 3 days to address the crisis Elena had created, but the council planned to stage a mass human killing at the venue and blame her publicly for the atrocity. Elena's team had 72 hours to infiltrate the most secure supernatural facility in existence, expose centuries of corruption, and survive long enough to present evidence that could transform vampire society. The safe house candles flickered with nervous energy as Elena's remaining allies gathered around plans that required precision timing and sacrifice from everyone involved. Her powers had stabilized enough to allow controlled shadow walking, but using them extensively would exhaust her to the point of vulnerability. Morgana's betrayal had left gaps in their intelligence about council security measures, and the king's house arrest meant Elena would face the assembly without his direct support. But Isabella's research had revealed one crucial advantage Elena hadn't known she possessed. Her hybrid nature allowed her to invoke ancient laws that predated the council's authority, traditions from an era when vampires and humans shared power equally. The right of blood justice permitted any being with mixed heritage to challenge corruption through ritual combat, but exercising this right required Elena to risk everything on single combat with Elder Cassius himself. As her team prepared for infiltration of the Grand Assembly, Elena studied her mother's final recordings one last time. Isabella's voice carried across the years with desperate hope that her daughter would use their shared tragedy to create something beautiful from the ashes of everything the council had tried to destroy. "You were made to be a bridge," Isabella had recorded. "Not a weapon to divide our peoples, but a bridge to bring them together. The power to choose your own purpose is my final gift to you. Use it wisely, my beloved daughter." Elena closed the files and shouldered equipment that would help her team navigate the assembly's supernatural defenses. In 3 days, she would face the gathered might of vampire authority with nothing but truth, courage, and the love of a mother who had sacrificed everything to give her daughter the power to choose justice over programming. The hunt was about to become a reckoning that would reshape the supernatural world forever. Elena adjusted the elegant mask that concealed her identity while transforming her appearance into that of a traditional vampire noble attending the Grand Assembly's most prestigious social event of the century. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across marble floors, where the vampire elite gathered to celebrate what they believed would be Elena's public destruction. Ancient bloodlines mingled with newly elevated nobles, their conversations weaving around politics and power, while human servants moved invisibly through the crowd, carrying refreshments that masked more sinister purposes. Her enhanced senses detected the pulse of terrified human hearts somewhere beneath the ballroom floor, dozens of kidnapped victims waiting to be slaughtered and blamed on Elena's supposed rampage. The council's plan was elegant in its simplicity. During the evening's ceremonial presentations, they would reveal the basement prisoners as evidence of Elena's terrorism, execute them publicly as an act of justice, and use the massacre to justify emergency powers that would eliminate supernatural democracy forever. But Elena had studied the Assembly's architectural plans with obsessive attention to detail, and Isabella's research had revealed hidden passages that connected the ballroom to underground holding areas through maintenance tunnels that even the Council's security forces didn't monitor completely. Her team was already in position throughout the building, ready to document the truth and broadcast it to supernatural communities worldwide. As Elena moved through the crowd with practiced grace, she overheard conversations that confirmed her worst fears about the Council's broader ambitions. Tonight's false flag operation was merely the opening move in a campaign that would extend Council authority over human governments, establish vampire supremacy as the natural order, and eliminate hybrid children as threats to pure bloodline dominance. The elegant masks and formal attire couldn't disguise the predatory nature of beings who viewed entire species as resources to be managed for their convenience. Lady Anastasia, an elder vampire whose family had profited from centuries of human exploitation, discussed expansion plans for the feeding grounds network with casual indifference to the suffering involved. Lord Victor compared genetic research facilities to livestock breeding programs, his tone suggesting no meaningful difference between hybrid children and agricultural products. Elena's modified programming responded to their emotional resonance with cold fury that required all her self-control to contain. Near the ballroom's center stage, Elder Cassius prepared for ceremonies that would allegedly expose Elena as a monster while positioning himself as the savior of supernatural stability. His speech would invoke ancient laws and traditional values while systematically dismantling every protection that prevented vampire authorities from treating humans as disposable commodities. The Grand Assembly's democratic elements would be suspended indefinitely for emergency management of the crisis Elena had supposedly created. Through concealed communications, Elena confirmed that her allies had successfully accessed the basement holding areas and were documenting the prisoners' conditions while preparing extraction routes that would save as many lives as possible. The evidence they gathered would prove the Council's guilt, but only if Elena survived long enough to present it to the assembled supernatural community. The former vampire king entered through the ballroom's main doors, his arrival causing a stir among nobles who hadn't expected to see him outside his house arrest. His presence changed the evening's political dynamics, providing Elena with an ally whose authority still commanded respect even among his enemies. But his freedom also meant the council felt confident enough in their plan to allow him to witness Elena's destruction personally. As midnight approached and ceremonial presentations began, Elena positioned herself near the stage where Elder Cassius would soon call for her public execution. Her mother's research files were hidden throughout the ballroom in locations that would survive whatever violence erupted when the truth was finally revealed. Isabella's voice echoed through Elena's memory, with final words of love and encouragement. "Tonight, we end this charade," Elena whispered through encrypted channels to her allies. Together came the response from the king, whose own voice carried determination that had sustained him through centuries of leadership and loss. The masquerade was ending, and Elena's choice to embrace justice over programming was about to face its ultimate test. Elena stepped forward as Elder Cassius began the ceremony that would allegedly expose her as a monster, but instead of hiding behind her disguise, she dropped the elegant mask and faced the assembled vampire elite with her true identity blazing like a beacon of defiance. The Grand Assembly fell into shocked silence as Elena Martinez, the supposed terrorist who had thrown their world into chaos, stood before them not as a cornered victim, but as an accuser armed with evidence that would shatter everything they believed about their own righteousness. "I am my mother's daughter and my father's heir," Elena declared, her voice carrying across the ballroom with harmonics that resonated through both human and vampire frequency ranges. "I am the bridge you fear, and I claim my right to challenge this corruption." The crystalline air charged with power as Elena's hybrid nature responded to her acceptance of her true purpose, not as a weapon created by the Council, but as a bridge between worlds who chose to serve justice rather than authority. Ancient words of law echoed through the assembly as Elena invoked rights that predated Elder Cassius's power, traditions that demanded her accusations be heard before the entire supernatural community. Elder Cassius attempted to have her killed on the spot, but the Vampire King's dramatic intervention and declaration of Elena as his heir created a legal shield that even the council couldn't break without violating laws they had sworn to uphold. Combat erupted between traditionalists who served the council's vision of vampire supremacy and reformers who believed in Elena's promise of coexistence, the elegant ballroom transforming into a battlefield where the future of supernatural society would be decided by force and conviction. Elena fought not just with the abilities inherited from her hybrid nature, but with the moral authority of every victim whose suffering she had documented, every child whose life the council had destroyed, every human whose freedom had been stolen for vampire profit. Her mother's love flowed through modified programming that turned Elena's engineered abilities against their creators, making her a weapon of justice rather than oppression. The battle raged across marble floors slick with spilled blood as Elena claimed her birthright publicly, her courage inspiring other supernatural beings to choose reform over tradition, hope over fear, justice over the comfortable certainties of established power. Through it all, Isabella's research played on screens throughout the ballroom, revealing the truth about trafficking operations, genetic experiments, and plans for human subjugation that made clear the stakes involved in Elena's victory or defeat. As dawn approached, and the assembly's windows filled with natural light that had been forbidden in vampire gathering places for centuries, Elena stood surrounded by allies who had chosen to support her vision of a world where love could triumph over programming, where bridges between species could be built from understanding rather than domination. The Grand Assembly acknowledged her right to invoke blood justice, the ancient law that would settle the conflict between Elena and Elder Cassius through ritual combat, where only one would survive to shape the supernatural world's future. Elena faced Elder Cassius in the Assembly's ritual circle as dawn light streamed through windows that had been sealed against sunlight for centuries, her hybrid nature allowing her to fight effectively in conditions that weakened her purely vampire opponent. The duel combined physical combat with supernatural abilities, Elena's shadow walking and enhanced strength matching against Cassius's centuries of experience and political cunning translated into raw power that had dominated the supernatural world for generations. But Elena fought with advantages Elder Cassius couldn't match. Her connection to both human and vampire natures gave her access to abilities he had never encountered. Her mother's programming modifications turned her genetic conditioning into a weapon against those who harmed innocents, and her choice to embrace justice over authority armed her with moral certainty that transformed every strike into an act of righteous vengeance for victims who had never received justice. The combat exposed Cassius as Isabella's true killer, when Elena's empathic abilities detected the specific emotional resonance of his memories, his satisfaction at murdering the woman who had threatened his power structures. The revelation turned even some traditionalist vampires against him, as they realized the extent of his willingness to destroy anyone who challenged his authority. Elena's victory came at the cost of her immortality, as the ritual circle's ancient magic demanded a price for the justice she invoked. Her hybrid nature had always been unstable, a bridge between species that couldn't exist permanently in either world. Defeating Elder Cassius required her to burn out the vampire elements of her genetics, leaving her mortal but alive, while her opponent crumbled to dust under the weight of centuries of accumulated guilt made manifest through supernatural law. "I choose to remain human," Elena declared, as the assembly watched her transformation from hybrid weapon to mortal woman who had saved both their species from the council's vision of permanent subjugation. "Then you choose to die," Cassius had replied during their combat, unable to understand why anyone would surrender immortality for principle. "I choose to live," Elena had answered, her victory proving that some things were more valuable than eternal existence. The Grand Assembly stood in awed silence as Elena remained standing while her opponent fell, acknowledging her right to reform vampire law and establish new traditions based on coexistence rather than dominance. Her choice to embrace mortality rather than power created a template for others to follow, showing that bridges between species could be built through sacrifice and love rather than genetic engineering and political manipulation. As the sun rose over the assembly building, Elena held Isabella's research while surrounded by vampires and humans working together to create the new order her mother had died trying to establish. The hunt that had driven Elena through sewers and cathedrals had ended with her transformation from victim to victor, from weapon to bridge builder, from programmed asset to champion of justice, who proved that love could overcome any conditioning when given the power to choose freely. Elena stood in the renovated council chambers where sunlight now streamed through windows previously sealed against the day, working alongside progressive vampires and human representatives to dismantle the trafficking operations that had operated in darkness for centuries. 1 month had passed since her victory at the Grand Assembly, but the work of transformation was proving more complex than the battle that had made it possible. Her enhanced senses, now stabilized in her mortal form, helped coordinate rescue operations that freed victims from facilities across multiple continents, while her understanding of both human and vampire psychology bridged communication gaps that had prevented cooperation for generations. The new council Elena had established operated on principles of transparency and joint authority that challenged traditional vampire secrecy, but international supernatural powers viewed these reforms as threats to established order that had maintained stability for centuries. Messages from the European Vampire Covenant grew increasingly hostile as Elena's influence spread beyond her local jurisdiction, threatening wars that could expose the supernatural world to human scrutiny that both species had worked to avoid. The former vampire king had abdicated his throne in favor of the democratic structure Elena advocated, finding peace in supporting her vision rather than maintaining power that required him to enforce laws he no longer believed served justice. His relationship with Elena had evolved beyond the political alliance that had saved her life into partnership based on shared commitment to the future they were building together, despite the costs involved in transforming centuries of tradition. Elena's mortality added urgency to their efforts, as she realized her shortened lifespan meant training others to continue the work she had started, building institutions strong enough to survive her eventual death while flexible enough to adapt to challenges she couldn't foresee. The hybrid children emerging after her example would need guidance and protection from those who viewed them as abominations rather than bridges, requiring Elena to establish schools and support networks that could operate independently of her direct involvement. Change doesn't end with one victory, Elena told her allies as they prepared for challenges that would test their commitment to reform over the decades ahead. "Then we keep fighting," came the response from vampires and humans who had learned to work together under Elena's leadership, their determination proving that the bridge she represented could be replicated and expanded through education and example rather than genetic engineering and political manipulation. The safe houses Elena had used during her flight from the blood hunt were being converted into centers for hybrid education and species cooperation, their hidden networks now serving hope rather than desperation. The evidence Isabella had died to preserve was being used to prosecute council members worldwide while establishing legal frameworks that protected both supernatural and human rights under systems of justice that recognized the dignity inherent in all conscious beings, regardless of their species or origin. As Elena received another threatening message from international vampire authorities, who refused to accept her reforms, she realized her victory had been only the beginning of a much larger struggle that would determine whether love and justice could indeed bridge any divide when given the institutional support and moral commitment necessary to transform ideals into practical reality. The hunt that had revealed her true nature was over, but Elena's work as a bridge between worlds was expanding into legacy that would outlive her mortal existence. Elena knelt beside her mother's grave as afternoon sunlight filtered through trees that had grown around the cemetery in the years since she had transformed vampire society through choice rather than programming. Fresh flowers replaced wilted ones, while her enhanced but mortal senses detected the peaceful silence that had replaced the constant danger she had lived with throughout her battle against the council's corruption. The school for hybrid children she had established in the renovated mansion buzzed with laughter and learning as young bridge builders discovered their abilities under guidance that emphasized choice over programming, love over authority, justice over the comfortable certainties that had nearly destroyed both human and vampire communities. Her partnership with the former vampire king had evolved beyond political necessity into love that transcended species boundaries, their relationship proving that bridges between worlds could be built through understanding and commitment, rather than genetic manipulation or ancient laws that served power structures instead of individual dignity. The international threats Elena faced from traditional vampire authorities remained serious challenges that required constant vigilance and diplomatic skill. But the network of allies she had built provided support systems strong enough to withstand pressures that had previously isolated reformers and made them vulnerable to persecution. Her mortality meant Elena's time was limited, but the institutions she had created were designed to survive her death while adapting to challenges she couldn't anticipate, ensuring that her mother's vision of coexistence would continue developing through others who shared the commitment to justice that had transformed Elena from weapon into bridge builder. "Mom, I finished what you started," Elena said quietly to Isabella's memory, while placing photographs beside the headstone that showed the integrated family of humans and vampires Elena had chosen to build around herself. "And now I'm starting something new." The evidence of new life growing within Elena represented the next generation of bridge builders who would inherit a world where her mother's dreams could flourish without the persecution and secrecy that had forced previous hybrid children to live in hiding or die defending their right to exist. As evening approached and Elena prepared to return to the work that filled her shortened lifespan with meaning, she understood that her journey from desperate orphan to revolutionary leader had created possibilities for others that would extend far beyond her own mortality, proving that love and sacrifice could indeed triumph over programming and fear, and that even a life measured in fragile human years could reshape the destinies of immortal beings when it was lived in service of a future where no child would ever again be forced to choose between what they had been made to be and what they dared to dream they could become.